Guitar Business Radio is the podcast for the business of guitar, where you'll always get no reviews, no demos, and no idle chatter. From players to CEOs and in between. If you have a professional or business connection to the world of guitar, this show is your window to insight and information you won't get anywhere else. I'm Jeffrey D. Brown, and I approve this message. So let's get to it. From Guitar Business Media, welcome to episode 36 of GBR. There's a lot of good stuff going on with the show, and as I've said multiple times, this is and will always likely be a work in process, which I believe is an idea that can be applied to so much in our businesses and our lives in general. If you think about it, everything is always changing. A couple of noticeable changes. One that we announced last week is that we've moved our release day back to Wednesdays now. I'm not sure I can even tell you why it was ever Monday in the first place. It just was, and that always meant that the show had to be finished up Sunday nights. So after 35 weekends of producing the show for Monday, we changed it. So Wednesday is the new day. We're also once again making some adjustments to the format of the show based on feedback from our listeners, which, by the way, we do appreciate. And many of you have said, can we just get to the interview a lot sooner? Well, I don't think that's an unreasonable request at all, so that's what we're going to be doing. And on top of that, on today's show, we're doing something different as well. I've wanted to do this for a while, and so we're presenting our Greatest Foundational Hits, Volume 1, Players. Now, over time, we hope to bring you interviews with more players that you know who can talk about their experience in the business of guitar, along with our regular lineup of industry people. And so to get you familiar with some of the great players we've already had on the show, we decided to put together an episode that features the foundational discussions that I've had with each player. That's the front part of the interview where we talk about the beginnings. And I think you'll find that it's an interesting comparison of how each of these folks got their start in the business without having to listen to the whole interview. So today, our Greatest Foundational Hits Volume 1 features 5 players, each with a great story to tell, and we'll hear how they got into the business and what kind of foundation they built that helped them advance their career. And you'll be hearing from Bruce Forman, Chris Standring, Carl Verheyen, Nathan East, and Peter White. So with that, let's get right into something completely different. Well, Bruce, thanks for coming on the show today with us. Great to have you.
Oh, it's a pleasure, at least so far.
Yeah. Well, it's we'll get into it a little further, and then we'll all know.
Yeah, we can fix that, though. I'm sure. Yeah.
I don't doubt it. And listen, in full disclosure, I've been around a long time, I'm afraid to say, but I've also been a big fan of your work for many years. So on a personal level, it's kind of a thrill of sorts to have you on the show. So I always like to start off these interviews with some foundational stuff. I use that word a lot, but I can't seem to get away from it. And this is so that we can have a sense of what a career or a business is built on, understanding that a lot of things change over the years. So with that in mind, could you give us a sense of how this all started for you, up to the point where you felt you were really in the business?
Wow.
That's a mouthful, I know. You take it anywhere you want to go.
I was really just into the music in high school and playing gigs and hanging out with really great musicians and just consumed with it and just sort of was working before I even considered the words career or business, and just kind of started playing and didn't want to do anything else. It came time to go to college. I considered going to North Texas State. That's what it was called back then, and which was one of the only jazz schools going. And I just kind of went and auditioned and just saw the scene there. And I was living in San Francisco at the time, and it was a really great time for jazz in San Francisco. And I just sort of said, well, I could go to spend 4 years here with a bunch of kids learning jazz, or I could hang out in a town where Bobby Hutcherson and Joe Henderson and Woody Shaw lived and played all the time. So And those are just the famous ones. I mean, there were literally dozens of unbelievable musicians in a great scene, even though it was somewhat eclipsed by the rock and roll scene that was happening then. It was just something I did and kind of followed, and I was making enough money to do what I needed to do. So the career just sort of happened to me more than making a actual choice, like writing a chart and going, well, this will get me the best for this. Or whatever.
Yeah. You didn't write a business plan or anything like that.
No, I didn't. And it should be pretty obvious to most people by now.
Well, there's no rules with that kind of thing. I think that's the beauty of this kind of work, is that it is pretty organic and it does evolve on its own. One thing that I wanted to touch on in that same topic area is that you started playing at, about what age? I mean, you said you kind of were in high school and you were playing it. Sort of the development of your playing started when?
Well, I mean, God, I played classical piano as a kid and switched over to guitar at about 12 or 13. And got really bitten by the jazz bug at around 14. Mm-hmm. I guess, freshman, sophomore year of high school. And that's kind of where I really just threw myself into just wanting to know how it all worked and wanting to play it and, wanting to be part of the community of people that played it.
Yeah. So you were really driven, it sounds like.
Yeah. I'm a self-motivated individual, definitely.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking time out to come on GBR with us today. It's great to have you on.
Well, it's great to be had, Jeff. Very nice.
Well, I don't know so much about that, but I hope we're going to have a good time, and that listeners are going to get a lot of good stuff out of it too. So let's dig in. It's kind of a tradition here at GBR to start off with some foundational stuff, and you've had a very entrepreneurial career as a player, and we're going to talk more about that. But first, I'd like to hear a little bit about what we call those building blocks in the early part of your life that have had the most impact in guiding you in your later life. So however you want to take that question, the floor is yours.
Do you mean as a player or as a business person? I guess back in the day.
Typically
it's
what,
so seamless.
Some people talk about their childhood. What things did they learn growing up? Some people, it's that kind of thing. So it's kind of an open-ended question, right. But everybody has those kinds of things, and it's what do you look back at and see is what made the most difference? What has contributed to the foundation upon which my career in business sits today. So there you go.
Well, I think, my formative years were basically just led by a massive desire to play the guitar for no other reason. And, obviously the business thing came way later.
Sure. But how old was that, Chris, when you really had that desire? Like 2 or 3 or what?
Well, yeah, actually. I mean, I had toy guitars every birthday until I was old enough to hold a real one. And so I got my first classical guitar at age 6.
Great.
And after that point, of course, there were torturous years of playing very simple music and not really understanding. But the nice thing about learning at such an early age is you get that discipline and, the fact that you're told to go to your room and practice the guitar. Musicians are never afraid to be on their own simply because that's what we've known for so many years, and it's a good thing to do it so young, because we get those formative years as great building blocks for discipline, So that happened until I went to boarding school age 15 and studied rock and roll and got in bands and all types of bands, actually, including a punk band, would you believe? And I think at that point, once I got into a band with all my school chums, I then realized, well, this is something I actually would like to do for a living if it's possible, So that happened kind of age 15 or 16. Mm-hmm. And then I became a rebellious teenager wanting to go to London and squat in a house and be in a rock and roll band, how everybody does when they're when they're young.
Sure.
Thankfully, my parents disallowed that, and I went to lots of colleges. Ended up at the London College of Music. Did a 3-year performing diploma in classical guitar.
Got it.
So I had some good foundational stuff under my belt, and I became a session musician for the next 20 years or so. I mean, that's all I knew, Jeff. You know what I mean? It's like it was just so inculcated at that point. I didn't really know what else to do, and I loved it though. You know, it was something that when we're teenagers and kids, you know, if you can find something that's unique to you, you manage to exist in this little bubble of your own, and it's a comforting thing knowing that you've got something that you can call your own. You know,
was this you started off in UK basically,
yeah,
right? And this was and give us a sense of, and you said for 20 years, but was that entire 20 years in UK, or you know, at some point you came here?
That's right.
But
yes,
how long did you work as a session musician in UK?
Technically for 10 years. I went to music college in 1980, did 3 years there, and then spent the next 7 years freelancing as a guitar player in London, and not successfully for the most part, I will add. Not really understanding why, because I thought, well, if you go to music college and you get all this stuff under your belt and you learn to read and play in all styles and you're a fairly likable guy, all of a sudden the phone should ring. Well, it didn't.
Yeah. Well, what did you do during that time to feed yourself and pay rent, stuff like that?
Well, you know, back in London, we have something called the dole. Everybody signs on the dole,
right?
You know, and it's a great thing to be able to fall back on while you're trying to get your act together. I mean, I was always pretty driven, so I would do all I knew how to do to get ahead. I would do private teaching, and I had a band of my own that I was inviting all these players into, and slowly but surely the phone did ring, but it was mesmerizing to me for the longest time why it didn't happen all as quickly as I thought it was going to.
So, Carl, thanks so much for taking time to come on the show. Great to have you on.
Thank you for having me. This sounds really interesting.
Well, we try to make it interesting, especially for the listeners and hopefully for both of us. But let's start where we always do, with some foundational stuff, and have you talk about some of the things that became the most significant building blocks of your own foundation, and which of those have had the most impact on your career or business, any way you want to take it.
Well, early on, I started playing the guitar at age 11. I'd been begging for a guitar for a few years, and I got one on my 11th birthday and a lesson later that day. And I got some early on guitar lessons that showed me down the right path. And then I started teaching myself by listening to records by, the Allman Brothers and Cream and the Beatles and Hendrix and all that stuff. But at age 17, my parents took me out to dinner in Pasadena. And we were, my family, the 4 kids and my mom and dad. And as we walked out of the restaurant, there was a guy in a bar, and he was singing and playing acoustic guitar. And I said, I could do that. And so I asked for a meeting with the manager the next day. And I went down there and played for him, and he hired me, but he said, you can't work in a bar till you turn 18. So I had to wait 3 months, and then he gave me the gig. And that was just Sundays and Mondays, paying $35 a night. Mm-hmm. But then eventually he gave me Tuesday through Saturday, paying $75 a night. I'm 18 and a half years old, living at home, and just piling up the money, which was really my first real business experience. I'd played in a lot of high school bands and stuff, and, made my solid $35 a night and that thing.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that was a little restaurant called the Sawmill, and I did that for a few years, then moved to another one. But then I left there because I realized how much I didn't know. This guy came into the bar one night and said, hey, I like the way you play. You want to jam sometime? And I said, sure. So he said we got together. He was an older guy, and he just showed me this stuff that I had no idea about. And it's, for you guitar players out there, it's stuff like D minor 7 flat 5 chord, and I had no idea what that was. But he showed me about, 25 positions to play that chord. So
wow.
I figured I needed to study. So I went to, I left Pasadena City College and went to Berkeley for 1 semester. And that was a real building block, because what I learned about harmony there is something that's
now that's Berkeley up north, right? Not
Boston. Yeah.
Oh, in Boston. Okay.
Yeah, Berkeley College of Music, spelled Berkle.
Oh no, yeah, we're familiar.
So I started down that long, dark jazz highway and stayed with that very seriously through the 70s, and then. And I was studying with this amazing guy here in LA named Joe DiOrio.
Oh, sure.
And he was a real mentor for me, and he changed my life in many ways. He's one of those guys that you can count on one hand that really sets your direction down a different path. He had me write down all my musical ideas and try to make music sound different. That was his mantra: make music sound different. Like Herbie Hancock does, or he named anybody.
And yours does, by the way.
Oh, thank you so much. So then driving down the road one day in North Hollywood, I happened upon stuff, and I heard this amazing Joe Walsh solo on the radio, and it just made me pull the car over and realize that I love every kind of music. I like country music and jazz and bluegrass and rock and roll and heavy metal and Chet Atkins and anything that's good music, I love it. Why am I limiting myself? So that was a real milestone there. And I started just to study all my old heroes like Mike Bloomfield and Duane Allman and Clapton and just really got into, and then Chet Atkins and my friend Albert Lee, and really got into all kinds of stuff and didn't limit myself to any one thing, and just became a much more versatile player.
Well, Nathan, thank you so much for taking out the time of your busy schedule to join us here on Guitar Business Radio. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jeff. Great to stop by and see you here.
Beautiful. Well, diving in, as we say, you got a pretty early start in the business. And
my goodness.
I always like to begin with something that we refer to as foundational. And so I'm wondering what you can tell us about those early years in terms of the things that you might perceive to have had a lasting effect on your career in later life.
Absolutely. Well, the first thing is picking up a bass in the church, 14 years old, if I were to rewind back then. And I remember the day, and there was a little kind of a Gibson, I think it was a red bass sitting on a bass stand at the altar. And my brothers were playing in the folk masses in San Diego with my brother Ray, who's now a Monsignor, has his own parish in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
Ray East, and then David East, my big brother, he was playing guitar. So I was kind of tagging along with those guys, and there was this bass, and hey, I wonder if I could pick this up. Whose is this? And I picked it up, and immediately felt this kind of this spiritual energy and sort of a power, and also I just felt very familiar to me for whatever reason, and it was just something that I thought, there's something going on here. And literally 2 years later, I was on tour with Barry White and the Love in the Middle Orchestra, playing at Apollo Theater and Madison Square Garden and Cobo Hall in Detroit and all around the country. And I thought, at such an early age, I'm just thankful that I was able to hone in on what I would do, for the next several decades.
And was it pretty much apparent to you at that time that, that was the direction you were going to go?
Yeah, I was pretty sold. I mean, I did go to school, UC San Diego, and got my degree in music. And actually, I was starting my master's program when one of my instructors, Bert Turetsky, he just said, you should move to LA and make some money, and so he and Cecil Lytle, who is another instructor there, still mentors to this day. And, I moved to LA and next thing I know, phone was ringing. I'm in the studio with these people like Quincy Jones and
small time guy,
small. It's good. No, I mean, and these are people that I read about. And I used to get Downbeat in all the music magazines,
sure,
and
of course.
And so by reading the articles, you'd kind of get a little preview of what these people liked. And I remember Quincy. It stuck with me for a long time, making a statement. He said, "I'd rather have a guy that's not as good a player as another guy that's a diva, in the studio, So, in other words, his check your ego at the door and not have a guy with an attitude. I mean, that was one of the things that I think helped him to make such great music, because everybody's not only were they skilled proficiently, but their energy and the spirit of what they brought to the equation was so strong."
Well, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show with us, and welcome to GBR. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be here. Nice to talk to you.
Well, thanks. Okay, so I got to tell you, I've really been trying to come up with some fresh language to start the interviews off, and still get around to what I like to get around to, which is the foundational question. So I think in your case, I'm just going to start off with something like, what made you think you could become a professional musician? How about that?
Well, Jeff, that is a great question. I've been waiting for somebody to ask me that for years.
And I'm so glad I could accommodate.
Well, I obviously had an answer to this, because when I was 18, I left school and all my friends went to college. And I didn't. And I must have known at that point that there was something for me in music, because that was pretty much what consumed me in those days. And I knew that I had talent. I knew that I could play. I could play guitar and piano both pretty well at that point, because I'd learned a lot from listening. Well, on the guitar, it was mostly from listening to the radio, actually, because I didn't have that many records. Records were very expensive. Didn't have much money then. I had piano lessons. So those two things I knew were going to help me. And I knew that I could listen to music and I could pick it up pretty easily. And in rock music, which is what I was pretty much interested in at that time, that was really all that mattered. Nobody was going to ask me to read music. I was pretty certain. And in fact, that was the case for at least 20 years.
Wow.
That I was a professional musician, that no one ever asked me to read a piece of music.
That's
even
amazing.
Though I could read music.
You could read. You did.
Yeah, I could read music for the piano. I never really learned music related to the guitar. I didn't learn that way. I just kind of learned by ear. So even today, if you put a piece of music in front of me, I could play it on the piano, but on the guitar, I'd have to think, well, what is this note? Where do I start? Where do I put my fingers? Because I never really learned like that. And that might surprise people that I can read music, but I don't relate it to the guitar. I relate it to the piano. So at the age of 18, I must have had a lot of confidence in myself that I could actually make it. And the bands that I was interested in at that time, Led Zeppelin, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Genesis, they were all writing their own music. And I thought, I can do this, come up with music, embellish someone else's musical suggestion. I could improvise. I learned to do that by listening to Eric Clapton. I can do that. By the way, I barely could play a major scale on the guitar at that point. I didn't think it was that important. It was all pentatonic up to that point. It was just playing the blues. I mean, everyone in England, which is where I grew up, of course, was totally obsessed with the blues, much more so than the American.
Yeah, I kind of remember that. I do remember that. Yeah.
It's the 60s, and it started with a guy called Alexis Korner, quite honestly, and he started a band called Blues Incorporated in the early 60s. And this is how the Stones started, because they listened to him and they really got into the American blues. And the English guys would go to they go to find import albums from America. And I never did this, of course. I just listened to Eric Clapton. I didn't realize that the blues started much earlier than that. But yeah, everything on the guitar I played was the blues. And when I did play piano, I could play scales on the piano, and that's how I learned. I learned to play classical music. But there were kind of two worlds that didn't really meet for me.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But having those two abilities, I could play the piano. I could do a pretty fair imitation of some Keith Emerson pieces, because ELP had started. I was 16, I think, when Emerson, Lake and Palmer started. I loved that first Emerson, Lake and Palmer album.
Great stuff.
And I learned to play just about every keyboard riff. I would never say that I'm a budding Keith Emerson, but I did a pretty good job of imitating him. In fact, when I went for my first serious audition in London when I was 20 years old, that's what I played. They said, we know that you can play guitar and piano, and we're interested in someone that's a multi-instrumentalist. And I thought, well, this is a leg up here. If I was just a guitar player, I don't think they would have hired me. But I played some Keith Emerson stuff that I'd learned, and they said, great, you're in.
So you had some added value there, obviously.
Yeah. So, and by the way, as I was walking towards that audition, which was in London, which is a big deal for me because I lived in the countryside, and I took the train down there, I had a wave of fear come over me as I was walking down the street towards the place where they had the audition. And I thought, what am I doing? I've had all this confidence up to this point. All of a sudden, my confidence just dropped away. I'm going to be up against people who are much more experienced than me, much more knowledgeable, much more confident than me, much more self-esteem than me. What do I think I'm doing? I'm a kid growing up in the countryside and listening to some Emerson, Lake and Palmer albums, copying Eric Clapton on the guitar. Who the hell do I think I am? And yet, I walked right through that fear. And this is probably the biggest lesson that I ever learned in my life. I walked through the fear. I walked into the room. I played. I got the job. I started my career in music.
Well, that was fun. And if you haven't listened to some of those interviews previously, you might now be inclined to head back to that episode list and consume them in full. I certainly encourage you to do it. It's easy. I have to confess, I was laughing at myself as I was putting this episode together. It's not all about me, but in this particular case, I was laughing at me. Sometimes we do things over and over again in a certain way, and I do that with the interviews, and especially the so-called foundational section. It's kind of like releasing the show on Mondays. We're not sure why we do some of this stuff. We just do it, and it sticks, and then we're stuck with it. And I've been stuck doing the foundational stuff since the beginning. And as I listened to the clips, I realized I've been trying to get unstuck from it for a long time, but I'm still doing it. Almost like I've taken a tongue-in-cheek attitude about it, but it's part of the show. And, maybe I'll figure out something else, or maybe not. But while my intention was to create a showcase and a comparison of sorts for the player interviews, which was cool, I also did the same thing for myself. So if you're wondering why this guy does this foundational thing, well, I'm asking the same thing every week. I still don't have an answer. Well, one of these days, I may bust out of the mold and do something different. Like I said earlier, change is constant. I think we would all agree with that. But it's healthy. I can tell you, I feel a lot better producing this show for Wednesday in the middle of the week. This past weekend was the first weekend in 35 weeks in a row I haven't worked on the show. And man, did that feel good. Very, very good. I had no idea what a difference it would make until I finally said, I'm going to jump out of my comfort zone and do it differently. And lo and behold, the truth is, I'm actually a lot more comfortable in this zone than the prior zone, which indeed turned out to be much less comfortable. Wasn't really a comfort zone after all. And it's funny, for those of you who've listened to the end of this show more than once, you know how it ends. It's basically the same every week. I mean, I change a word or two, but same message. But what I've just told you here in the back of the show really in many ways goes against my own advice. And what might that be, you ask? Well, it's simple. Stay positive, stay focused on the destination, but keep all your options open on how you're going to get there. Keep the options open. Very important. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again on episode 37. And that's it for this episode of Guitar Business Radio. Thanks for being with us. You can stay tuned and stay in touch at guitarbusinessradio.com.